Hi, everybody. Okay, welcome back to our discussion of theories of myth. Basically, what we're going to do today is we're going to move on from Levi Strauss into a new scholar of myth, and this is Carl Jung. And we're going to talk about his idea called archetypes. And we'll build on that some more on Tuesday. We'll talk about how to analyze a myth using archetypes. But for today, we want to do the groundwork. Who is Carl Jung? How do his ideas work? Where is he coming from, basically? Get a sense of that. And what is this idea of archetypes that's so important? And we're even going to talk about Sigmund Freud, which should be interesting and kind of entertaining. So let's just dig right on into it. So, one thing we're trying to do in this second half of, or later part of the theories section of this course is answer the question we posed with prop, which is, prop is so much about structure. How do you get to analyzing the actual content? We saw one method with Levi Strauss where he talked about, finding the mythemes, finding pairs of opposites and trying to compare them and construct a meaning using those pairs of opposites. We're going to continue with Carl Jung, who has some different ways of getting at what is the meaning, what is the heart of the myth. And so let's give us some grounding on who was Jung and what was he trying to do. Well, this is where a myth starts interacting really heavily with psychology, or sometimes you hear the word psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is this older form of psychology that at its best was influenced by the best ideas of Jung. And so you can think of Jung as a kind of psychiatrist in a way. That was his given profession. He would try and help people figure out their psychology, and he would try and figure out what is sort of the stories and myths that are important to them. And he would do this all through dreams. So the psychoanalytic therapy said that basically dreams are the key to unlocking what's deeper in someone's psychology. Because dreams come from us, right? They come from our own personal demons, personal heroes, personal aspirations. So, we may think that dreams are this big sort of mess of nonsense, but actually they're connected to what we think, what we believe, what we've experienced. So Jung and his predecessors in this idea, this field of psychoanalytic therapy, felt that they could use dreams to figure people out and get a deeper, better sense of their psychology. And the very interesting thing for our purposes, because why are we talking about dreams in a course about myths? Well, Carl Jung argued that myths and dreams are actually very similar. Myths and dreams are both dealing with the subconscious parts of our minds. Myths just do it on a larger scale. Myths do it for the whole society, but dreams do it for the individual. So one quotation or phrase that's sort of used to describe him is, dreams are the private myth. Myth is the public dream. Dreams are the individual sort of things that we come up with as a way of interpreting each of our individual lives, coming up from the back of our head, from the deeper wells of who we are and what's in our minds. And dreams are that on the scale of the whole society. Myths are that on the scale of the whole society. A society has these ideas that are important to it, these ideas that it's questioning, it's thinking about, it's wondering about. And then from those questions come myths in the same way that dreams come from our minds when we sleep. And this is an explanation for why myths and dreams are so weird. Because they're not coming from this process of logical cause and effect. If you're trying to write a history book, that's a very different process than telling a mythical story, right? In myths, we don't care most of the time, about the logic. We might care a little bit about the internal logic, but it's okay if it's inconsistent or if it's kind of weird or kind of random. And it may not always seem to have a point. It may seem to be going in some weird direction, like, why did that guy kill his father and marry his mother? It's like, who came up with that? Well, Jung would say that came from our subconscious minds. And we're going to get into in a second here what I mean by subconscious. But let's just say for now, it's a part of our minds that is not the conscious part of our minds, not the immediate surface level. It's sort of going in deeper to the deeper more mysterious level. And myths and dreams are about processing these things that aren't on the surface, these things that are deeper problems, bigger questions, and not this sort of logical, linear, making sense part of our brains. And so, yeah, that's a pretty good answer to why do myths contain so much that is bizarre, sometimes even off-putting or unsettling, is because dreams are that way. And we'll take a look in a second as to why myths and dreams, how does the process of myths being related to dreams work? But first, we've got to establish this idea of the subconscious mind, which Jung had, really made a lot of use out of. Now, Jung was writing a while ago. His latest work was in the 1960s, so some of his ideas are going to be a bit archaic. And he was also, he was basing his work on a predecessor whose ideas are considered today really archaic and not really believed in anymore. And that was Sigmund Freud. But yeah, just to situate us a little bit more, the time period, Carl Jung was a Swiss scholar. He was very active in this field of psychoanalysis in Switzerland and in Europe, and so was Sigmund Freud. All right, so Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud came along in the Victorian era. And if there's one thing that people know about the Victorian era, it's that people were kind of repressed. And it's Sigmund Sigmund Freud himself, I believe, who came up with this concept of this idea of repression. So if you think about what is repression, what's this idea of repressed? Well, our stereotype of the Victorians is people who were very afraid of sex, very reluctant to engage with sexuality or sexual topics, seeing it as a big taboo. Freud came along during this time period, started this time period moving into more of the modern contemporary time period. Start of the modern contemporary time period, end of the Victorian time period. And he said, this is actually a real problem for people, that we are repressing so much and trying to bury these parts which are pretty natural to ourselves, which are these sexual parts, these parts of sexuality and desire and fantasy and things like that. And so Freud is kind of responding to this culture of repression in a lot of ways. And Freud argues that repression is the cause of people's psychological problems. And what is this repression? How do we actually define this? Basically, repression is when you are suppressing emotions and feelings and not letting them come to like the surface level of your brain, the conscious level of your brain. You're burying them, you're compartmentalizing them because you don't want to think about them. And usually the reason that Freud identifies for this is because they're taboo. There's something that society doesn't approve of. So we try really hard not to think about it. Oh no. And what this causes is what Freud called neurosis, psychological problems, psychological incompleteness, not being a full, confident person. That comes from all this repressing that we're doing. And it just sort of leads to this state in which a person is not psychologically healthy. And Freud felt that you could see the signs of this in people's dreams. So you could interpret the dreams. Your process would be to get the patient, because Freud was also a psychoanalyst, a early kind of therapist. And so you'd take the patient and you'd ask them to tell you about their dreams, and you'd think about what's going on in the dreams, and you'd try and interpret what is the thing that they're repressing that's causing them so much trouble. And now here's where we get to the fun / weird part. And coming off the heels of Levi-Strauss, it's the perfect time for this, because Freud's big idea that he thought was the big leading cause of repression in most people was what he called the Oedipus complex. So we talked about Oedipus quite a deal, quite a lot, quite a large amount. And so we all know that it is the story of the guy who killed his father and married his mother. Sigmund Freud argued that people in general actually want to do this, that this is a psychological problem that almost everybody is wrestling with, at least among men. And for women, it's the reverse. He argued that women want to kill their mother and marry their father. And so his idea of the Oedipus complex is this psychological situation that human beings are very frequently in, where children from a young age internalize this anger at their same gender parent, and so they want to kill them and have this sort of desire or sort of over emotional connection to their opposite gender parent, and so they want to marry them. Now, there are two ways of looking at this idea. Maybe like the best case for it and the best way of having this idea of the Oedipus complex is to see it sort of loosely as a metaphor, because you can identify, and Freud did identify, that there are inherent tensions between parents and children. We talked about this some in talking about fairy tales and why fairy tales have so many evil stepmothers and things like that. And that author, Bertolt Brecht, who came up with the idea that, the evil stepmothers represent a way of dealing with one's actual mother as a kid and, letting out these sort of tensions, he was drawing very heavily on Freud's work. He was a Freudian. And so maybe you can make the argument that, children grow up having these both positive and negative relationships with their parents. Positive because the parents are sources of affection and love and good things in your life, pretty much everything in your life, and negative because they are also the ones who tell you what not to do. They're the ones who take things away from you, and sometimes that can be quite bad. So it's both a positive and a negative relationship. And Freud thought that for young men, for boys, this relationship with the mother was generally positive, but then this rivalry develops with the father. And girls, it starts off that way, but then it flips around over time. That's what he thought. Now, that's the best way of interpreting this. The other way of interpreting this idea of an Oedipus complex is to say, oh no, this is literally sexual and murderous. That, people literally want to kill their fathers and marry their mothers. And it's not super clear to me that Freud didn't think that part too. I think he certainly seemed to apply it a lot of the time. And the reason he had for this is he thought anyway, that sexual desire and childhood psychology were basically one and the same. That babies lusted after their mothers effectively because the mother was the source of food. They had this obsession with the mother's body, and then later on, if there's a healthy development, that turns into normal human sexuality. But he argued that so many people were trapped in their sort of childhood sexuality. So in fact, I would say pretty much all modern child psychologists don't really believe in this concept of like this childhood sexuality. If they do think that there's, some sort of proto-sexuality in children, it's not anything like that. Child psychology has come a long way and uses like actual neuroscience and talks about brain stages and developments. You can look up the work of Jean Piaget if you want to know more about that. But I would say this theory of how children's minds work is pretty much outdated. And in general, Freud's ideas are pretty outdated. That said, there might be a grain of truth in saying that children have both positive and negative relationships with their parents that come out in their psychology. But I don't think it's quite so linear or so systematic as he wanted to be, right? Like, men always want to kill their fathers and women always want to kill their mothers, He called that the Electra complex, by the way, after a mythological figure, Electra, who wants to kill her mother, Clytemnestra. But to be fair, Clytemnestra killed her father, Agamemnon. But to be fair, Agamemnon killed her sister, Clytemnestra's daughter. So it's a bit of a complicated family mess. And anyway, I would say that Sigmund Freud was wrong to say that women have this complex. And I would say that Carl Jung, that ended up being his biggest problem with Sigmund Freud. So we are all kind of on the same page with Carl Jung about that one. Jung trained under Freud in some ways. He was kind of, a teacher, a mentor to Jung, but he broke away in part because his ideas were different, and in part they were different because he really didn't buy this Oedipus idea. Now, what he did buy was this idea of repression. if we bury things in our psychology, especially the things that we are avoiding, that we consider shameful in some way, that does lead to psychological problems. That's what Jung would say, and what he basically learned from Freud. And I'd say that's a pretty decent legacy for Freud to have. It definitely helped people break out of that Victorian mindset and start talking about the ways things we didn't want to talk about actually affect who we are. And in general, Freud has a lot of problems. His research doesn't hold up super well. I think there's a great book. Yeah, I think it's called Freud, The Making of an Illusion, if you want to read sort of the big takedown of Sigmund Freud. But today, psychologists do not consider his theories very rigorous, in part because, well, the Oedipus complex, also just his methods weren't very good. And his way of going about things was often left a lot to be desired. For instance, women coming to him saying that they had been, abused by father figures or older men, and he said, "Oh, this must be a fantasy that they're having because of the Electra complex." And like, no. That Freud, why did you do that? It's because you didn't believe them, and that's really bad. So yeah, a lot of problems with Sigmund Freud. But that's my little spiel on him. And now we can kind of go ahead and put him in the trash can, because we're moving on to Jung. Now Jung, a lot of his ideas are kind of, there's still some debate around his ideas, but I would say in general, Jung's method of psychoanalysis is considered a lot stronger than Freud's and based on something more substantial. People haven't quite figured out what is the exact relationship between Jung's ideas and modern neuroscience, but I think they are still sort of capable of working together. At least that's my opinion. So, what did Jung do with this idea of repression? Well, he used to develop this idea of the conscious and unconscious mind. So I've alluded to this already. The conscious mind is the part of us that thinks it's ourself, the thoughts that you think, the things that you very clearly want to do, and the part of you that sort of seems to make decisions. The part of you that thinks it's in charge, the part of you that you're aware of, all the surface level things you notice about yourself. But once you get beyond a certain point, there's the unconscious mind. There's the part of you that just absorbs a lot of ideas and emotions, that is not just on the surface level, in the moment, responding to the moment. The part of you that builds habits and builds patterns, the part of you that collects memories. I think modern neuroscience has been a little skeptical about the idea of the unconscious, because there's not like a part of the brain that has the unconscious. But I think you can make a case for it that there are lots of different parts of the brain that work on more long-term things and aren't like immediately accessible to us. And I think that has a fair case to be called the unconscious. And one of the things that that Jung said over and over again is that the conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. It is such a small percentage of who we are compared to like the level of the amount of stuff going on in the unconscious mind. We absorb so much stuff from the world around us. And this is connected to Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. So the collective unconscious is that basically all our sort of interactions with each other, we share stories, we share ideas, we're all part of this one sort of unified human thing, which is the collective unconscious. Our unconscious minds, we communicate things from our unconscious minds to other unconscious minds. Whether that's in the form of telling stories, telling myths, sharing ideas, having advertisements that promote a certain like body image or something like that. Any of those things, and we might not even notice that they're affecting us, but they go deeper into this well of material, of stuff that our brains draw on. And this is quite literally what dreams are made of. This is the stuff that dreams are trying to process and file in a filing cabinet and organize and, connect the dots and connect ideas to other ideas. And so we're not just our own individual minds, we're connected to this whole network of other minds. And because of that, the collective unconscious brings forth ideas in sort of repeating patterns over and over again across human society. And part of it is about sharing those ideas again and again with each other in like a communication way. And part of it is because we go through similar problems that require similar solutions. For instance, we're born, we're children, we grow up, we become adults. Many of us do things like get married, have children of our own. We all die at some point, and we have to deal with that. So there are common repeating scenarios that we go through. On top of that, there's our biology. We have evolved as creatures to need to, deal with a certain set of problems and have a certain set of experiences. And so that's going to influence even the very structure of our brain. So some of this collective unconscious stuff is going to come from the way humans are made. So all of these factors go into there being things that we have in common in this sort of nebulous collective unconscious. And I think you could also talk about like a different collective unconscious for a different society, right? Like the ancient Greek culture had its own collective unconscious that had certain ideas that were important, which may be downplayed in, say, Hindu culture or Japanese culture. Those would have different concerns, partially, but then they would also have similar concerns in dealing with things like being born and dying and whatnot. So yeah, there's a lot going on there in that idea of collective unconscious, but that's some reasons why I think it's a plausible thing to have that. And the reason why the collective unconscious is important is because of Jung's idea of archetypes. So I talked about images that appear over and over again and ideas that appear over and over again in the collective unconscious. These are archetypes, meaning the first type or the leader type. So the sort of dominating thing in the human mind. Now, I might not have the same set of archetypes in my brain as you do in your brain, but I think society, maybe modern Western society, if you want to call it that, has its certain set of archetypes, and just the human race in general has a large collection of archetypes you can draw on. But Jung found something very interesting is that you can kind of reduce these archetypes. You can boil them down to some core ideas that are really the archetype themselves, less than, more like the archetype is this sort of unifying concept more than the individual version of that concept. For instance, the wise old man is the archetype. And then you have someone like Gandalf or Odin or let's see, a weird little old, maybe Rumpelstiltskin could fit into that category. Obi-Wan Kenobi. All of these would be the wise old man archetype, but those would be the individual versions of it. And we all have this ability to learn these archetypes from the world around us, and to some extent, like, go through experiences that need these archetypes. And so this is how Jung thinks mythology comes about, is coming from these archetypes. And we see the same darn archetypes in our dreams as we do in our myths. And so we can use one to think about the other. And so Jung's method of analyzing myths and dreams, and for that matter, even just stories in general, literature, is to find the archetypes and figure out what relationship they have to some kind of dreamer or some kind of human person experiencing them. So his first step will be to find to understand the story, the myth, or the dream, because he's being a psychoanalyst. He's saying, come in, tell me about your dreams. And then his next step will be to look through and find those archetypes. So in the next video, I am going to take a look at those archetypes and we'll go through them. There's a lot of archetypes you can get into, but if we really boil them down, Jung has some core concepts that I think are, the big 4 or 5 concepts that appear in his idea of dreams, and in his dreams too, in all our dreams. All right, so if you're dreaming of finding out about that, come join me in the next video.